Hello and welcome. I'm Jordan at Now Novel, and today I'll be speaking to Bonnie Traymore about her debut novel, Killer Motives, due out soon. Welcome, Bonnie.
Thank you, Jordan. Thanks for that introduction.
It's a pleasure. So, would you tell us a little about your novel, Killer Motives, and what inspired you to write it?
Motivation was really pretty simple. I've always loved to read mystery novels, and I love a page turner that kind of takes me away and makes me forget all my problems of the day. And that was really my motivation, was to try to kind of write something that would be a page turner and also be satisfying at the end, where the reveal would be plausible, but not obvious, but not just ridiculously impossible to figure out. And that puzzle, the challenge of doing that, was what was the motivation of starting the novel.
Great, thank you for sharing that. What was your writing process like for the story? Because here at Now Novel, we love to talk about process, because obviously writing a novel-length project is quite the challenge.
It is. I had a rough idea of what I wanted to do, and I had a pretty good idea of the ending. It was more like the middle. How was I going to flesh that out and keep it interesting? That was the part that was a challenge. I used the services of Hetty Lambert, who works for Now Novel, and she gave me an idea of taking Post-it notes and putting scenes and putting it on a whiteboard. Like just kind of pasting it on. And that worked pretty well for me. I know there's a lot of online stuff that you can do, but for me, the physical act of writing and putting it on got me off of the computer and standing up, because writing and sitting is such a sedentary process. And I'm a mover. I like to teach and move around. And so that physical putting the Post-it notes was actually better for me. So I started with that, and I had like a rough idea of where I was going with the scenes. And then I just kind of started writing. I'm more of a pantser than a plotter, as they say, the pantsers and the plotters. But I tried to be a little bit more restrained, and rein myself in a little, with being a little bit more structured.
Great. That's a great tip to move while you engage in the ideation, brainstorming part of the process, because I think, as you say, so much of it is sedentary, and that can almost stifle the free kind of flow of thought as well, not to move. That's very interesting. Also, what I wanted to talk about was, having worked with you in a copy editing capacity, what struck me was how much of the text was very polished to begin with. It's quite uncommon for writers of all experience levels for a draft to be as polished as it was. So it made more sense upon learning that you had your PhD in history. So obviously you've done a lot of writing, but I was interested to learn, having studied history to that level, what would you say that lent your craft or process as an author?
Well, I think, having written a master's thesis that was 150 pages and a doctoral dissertation that was 300 pages. I mean, it's a book, it's published, it can be downloaded. So I think that those processes, having so many eyes on that, I mean, I had a great mentor. Margot Henriksen was my mentor for my dissertation, and she edited my manuscript. And I, went back, and that you learn, I think, is just correcting and correcting and correcting.
Right.
But one thing that really stood out when I got your edits back, I think I mentioned this to you, is how even when you're really trying your best and looking over it, you can still make these really stupid mistakes. And I just felt so sorry for my students, because I thought, gosh, was I too hard on them? I was assumed like maybe they didn't proof it, but they probably did proof it. You just don't see it when you're in that creative mode, or just looking at it time and time again. You just miss things.
Absolutely. You do get error blindness. I find on the blog, people often point out errors where I think, oh my gosh, how could you have done that? But you do from reading your own work, and you shouldn't be your own editor. I mean, it's why the role of editor exists, essentially. Right. That's very interesting. So moving on to the story, what interests me about the story is you can see these cross currents of, you have a background in business, of course, and in realty, and also in history, and you can see all these things in your work. I'm interested to know, are there specific aspects of business, your experience in realty, maybe in history, that have contributed specific things to your storytelling or the way you approach writing?
invariably it will get in there just because it's what's in your head. I mean, you write what you know, you write people you know, and not that they're people that you're actually modeling them after, but it's just all that composites of all these things that you've seen and heard, and that's where your worldview is. So I think I also wanted to make it relatable. I think a lot of people have, looked for a house, gone house hunting, so they could relate to some of that. Whereas sometimes when you get too deep into somebody's profession, it might be a little bit boring for the reader unless they're really interested in that topic. So I stuck with things that were a little more like accessible, I think. But I do notice that some of the themes of gender and class that come up in the novel, I didn't intend to insert them in there. I think it just came out because that's maybe how I think, or that's what's topical news. And that's what characters might be talking about and saying. I mean, it has to be, realistic dialogue.
Another thing I really loved in the story was the connection between Jack and Lexi Sanchez, and that sense of mentoring and of care in that. And I thought, given your own background in career coaching as well, that must be something close to your own heart. And I was curious what in your view makes a good mentor.
I think when you look at someone as a mentor, although I have had mentors who were younger than me, I think they've mentored me well in like how to deal with or coach or relate to people younger than me. So I think you can also have mentors who are younger, but generally we think of older people being mentors of younger people. And I think that one of the things that came through and that comes through for me is you can be young and brilliant, you can be young and smart, but you really can't be young and wise. I mean, that's a different kind of thing. And so I think to develop wisdom, you've got to just live through things. And I that's kind of what Jack is doing with Lexi. He's just trying to like impart this like wisdom. And he's also a nod to some of my old, hard-boiled detective writers that I love, like Dashiell Hammett, and just the people who write those kind of curmudgeon-y but lovable, characters. And then she's sort of like a new, fresh kind of take on a detective, but they still have the same, issues when you're starting out. And it just like when you're mentoring somebody who's a young teacher or a young writer, being impatient, wanting black and white answers. I mean, the maturity that comes with that. So I think just pulling someone along, but also meeting them where they are, is kind of a good mentor.
That's such an interesting point, because in my experience, I've also worked in a coaching capacity with authors who are much older than myself. And what I love about it as well is just that then I feel like I am the beneficiary of their wisdom in some ways, but so there's that interesting collaboration across perspectives, across those kinds of experiences and things. So another thing I wanted to ask you about was I enjoyed how you keep the reader guessing about the identity of the killer. And I think you touched on this just now. You mentioned Dashiell Hammett, who is, of course, a great name in hard-boiled detective novels. But who are some of your favorite authors, and specifically crime mystery books?
There's a lot. And I think that it depends a lot on my mood and what's happening in my life. So, for example, like in the summers when I'm not reading a lot of heavy stuff, I'll pick up something by Louise Penny, who I love. And she just has this beautiful, her characters are just unforgettable. They stay with you. I feel like I know Inspector Gamache, I feel like I feel like he's a guy I could say, oh, that's him on the street. But sometimes it's a little dense for me. Like if I'm in a phase where I'm like reading 80 term papers and I just want something like boom, 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 I'll read like Shari LaPena, which is like, I can't put her novels down. She just writes novel after novel that just flow through my fingers. And I don't tend to like really remember her characters. It's just a different kind of read, but it's just as fun. And so I was trying to shoot somewhere in the middle with mine, make it a page turner, but also have a little depth with the history in there. I mean, I love Ken Follett and Pillars of the Earth, like that was a great historical read, but I didn't really want to write historical fiction, maybe someday, but right now I needed a break from that. So I peppered it in with the Sleepy Hollow and all the backstory, got my history in there, but.
Great, that's very insightful, thank you. Speaking of depth and dimension, I was also interested when you shared your PhD thesis topic was to do with feminism and the sexualization of femininity post-war, with the riot girl movement and all that. So I was interested because the book touches on themes relevant to this, such as, for example, the Me Too movement, workplace sexual harassment, and how often cisgendered women still face different rights and choices to cisgendered men even today, and a lot of lawmakers making decisions about women's rights are predominantly men. So I was thinking about this, and also at the same time, what I liked in the story was that your women and your male characters also all behave in morally gray ways at times, and so there's no like gender essentialism. Was this something that was important to you, or conscious or intentional, or if you could just speak about gender dynamics in context of the story?
It wasn't intentional that I didn't do gender essentialism. I think it's just a reflection of how I am. I really believe that there's a lot of gray areas. I mean, we know that sexual harassment happens. It's happened to many people. It's happened to me. It's happened to almost every woman I know. But we also know that sometimes it's overstated, and sometimes people are innocent, are accused who aren't. And so it's just a very gray area. And we're living in a time where people are really polarized and things are really black and white. And that's just not how I think. And that's not how I train my students to think. I train them, train, that sounds like, but teach my students to try to see the gray areas and see the other side. And with the social media and the echo chambers, I think people are just stuck in their camps, and life's not like that most of the time. I mean, most of the time people are nuanced and they have these different sides. I mean, we've all felt, I think, sometimes bad about something we did, and maybe we didn't make the ultimately great decision, but generally I think people are pretty good most of the time. So that's kind of what I was trying to get at, the complexity. And it's also because I work with young people all the time, it's something that's really topical right now, especially with the young girls that I work with. Reproductive rights and things like that are in the news, and the Me Too stuff. So it's just things that people are talking about, and that are timely, that just end up in your book because that's what's happening.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting when you say that about polarization in the echo chamber of social media, because essentially what you're talking about is critical thinking, which is, I think, also something that is such a privilege in terms of university education. Really, one of the things that does help you develop, I think, is critical thinking. I mean, it's all about writing papers and so on, and studying all these theories. It is really ultimately about investigating the gray areas in minute detail, and having to grapple with really complex thoughts and politics and positions and so on. So that's very interesting. One last thing I wanted to ask was, are there plans for sequel? I liked how Jack Stark has a folder of unsolved cases. So I immediately spotted an opportunity there for a serial or something of that nature.
Yeah, that's funny you say that, because I actually just started on it 2 days ago.
Oh, fantastic. Great.
I really feel like I want to, because my background's in education, I'm trying to find a way I have an idea for something that happens at a school campus, but I don't know if it's two separate books or if I could thread those characters in. So I'm kind of playing with that. But I thought that would be kind of easier for me because I know that world so well. Whereas like in this way, when I have Victoria as an art dealer and art historian, I mean, I don't really know that business as well. So I couldn't really put as much in as I wanted to. But if it's education, that's kind of my field, that would be kind of easier. I think that's why I've read a lot of writers, do what they know. They were private investigators or they worked for the CIA and then they write. So it could be kind of fun. And then of course I have a lot of ideas in my head just from being in that field. Yeah, I kind of like them. I'm not really done with those characters, so maybe fun to bring them back in some way.
Yeah, I definitely got the feeling of that from the story, so I'm very glad to hear that. That's
well,
great.
I don't want to give any spoiler alerts either, but I did sort of end a little ambiguously, in the epilogue with things. So I think there's room just to have a sequel for that, or it could be like combined with something that happens on a campus, a new situation that also develops.
Yeah, well, that's great. I look forward to finding out more once you're further on in the project. So thank you for this chat. It's been wonderful to hear about your process and your inspiration sources.
Thanks for interviewing me. It's my first official interview with an author, so
hopefully there'll be many more to come. Great. Thank you so
Hopefully.
much.
Okay. Thanks,
Thank
Jordan.
you. Thanks, Bonnie. Cheers.
Aloha.
Bye.